The night was so silent that even the ruins seemed to whisper. Greta Hoffmann pressed her little brother's face into her coat, hiding him from the cold, and from the soldiers she called monsters. The bombs had stopped falling, but their echoes still lived in her bones. To her, every American uniform meant death. Yet in a few days, one of those very uniforms would change everything, tearing apart everything she believed about hate, guilt, and mercy. Because sometimes the people you fear most are the ones sent to save you. Germany, spring of 1945, the war is ending. But the suffering isn't. The cities lie in ruins. Rivers carry ashes instead of reflections, and millions of children wander streets that no longer have names. Among them are Greta, 9 years old, and Lucas, 6, two faces lost in the smoke of a defeated nation. They have nothing but a torn photograph of their parents and the hatred their mother left behind. Never trust the Americans. Each night, they sleep in crumbling basements, flinching at the sound of boots. Greta tells Lucas stories about angels who will come for them, though even she doesn't believe it anymore. To her, the war ended when her family died. But fate wasn't finished with the Hoffmanns yet, because one man, an American soldier who'd fought the very war that took their home, was about to enter their lives. And what began as fear would soon turn into something no one expected. The war had ended, or so the newspapers claimed. But for Greta Hoffmann, it hadn't. The world around her might have stopped fighting. But inside her, the battle went on. She was 9, small and sharp-eyed, her face smudged with soot, her hair tangled like the weeds pushing through the ruins of Hamburg. Her 6-year-old brother Lucas clung to her hand as if it were the last safe thing in the world. The streets were quiet, the kind of quiet that made your skin crawl. Once, these streets had echoed with laughter, bells, and trams. Now only the crows remained, and the hollow moan of a city that had lost its soul. Their home had vanished one night in fire. Greta remembered the whistling bombs, her mother's scream, the way the world glowed orange. After that, there was only dust and running. She'd learned how to steal food, how to hide from soldiers, how to pretend she wasn't afraid. But she was afraid, every second of every day. To Greta, every American was a monster. Her mother had whispered it before she died. Never trust. The next morning brought rain, cold, relentless rain that washed the ashes down the gutters. Greta led Lucas toward the river, searching for anything they could eat. She had learned to move like a shadow, quiet, invisible. But hunger made her careless. Lucas slipped on the stones and cried out. The sound cut through the stillness like a knife. Greta spun around, ready to hush him, but it was too late. Footsteps echoed behind them. She froze. Her fingers clamped around a rusted pipe she'd been carrying like a weapon. The footsteps came closer, slower. Then she saw him, the same soldier from before. He wasn't wearing his helmet this time. His brown hair clung to his forehead, his uniform darkened by rain. He stopped a few steps away and crouched down, his hands raised slightly, palms open, the universal sign of peace. "My name's Jack," he said quietly, tapping his chest. "Jack." Greta didn't move. Lucas peeked from behind her coat, curious. Jack smiled, not with his mouth but with his eyes. Slowly he reached into his pocket and pulled out something wrapped in brown paper. Greta tensed. He unwrapped it. Chocolate. He didn't throw it, didn't tease. He just offered it, his hand steady despite the cold. Lucas took it. For a second, the war disappeared, replaced by the taste of something sweet, something warm. He smiled, and it broke Greta's heart. Jack said something again, words she couldn't understand. He pointed at the sky, then at them, then placed his hand over his heart. Greta watched in silence, every instinct screaming not to trust him. When he stood to leave, he nodded once, a small, respectful bow. Then he walked away. Greta stared after him for a long time. The chocolate was still melting on Lucas's fingers. That night, she whispered, "He's not like the others." But her voice trembled, because she didn't know if that made him safer or more dangerous. The third time they met, it wasn't by accident. Jack had asked around quietly about the children. The locals were wary. Most Germans still spat at the soldiers' boots. But one old woman had pointed toward the eastern ruins. "Two ghosts," she'd said. "A girl and a boy. They don't speak. They don't trust." When he found them again, the air was thick with mist. Greta and Lucas were huddled inside a crumbling warehouse, their small fire fighting the cold. Jack stepped carefully over the debris, his boots crunching softly. Greta leapt up, gripping her pipe again, her eyes wild. He stopped several feet away and raised both hands. "It's okay," he said gently. He placed a loaf of bread on the ground between them and stepped back. No weapons, no threats, just a gesture. Greta hesitated, her eyes darting between him and the bread. Finally, she took a step forward, snatched it, and backed away. Lucas tore into it instantly, crumbs spilling onto his lap. Jack smiled faintly. He didn't move closer, just watched them eat. For the first time in months, someone was watching them without wanting something in return. Rain began to fall again, slipping through holes in the roof. Jack shrugged off his jacket and laid it near them. Greta hesitated, then slowly pulled it closer. It smelled like dirt, metal, and something else. Safety. He spoke softly, almost as if to himself. Greta didn't understand the words, but she understood the tone. There was no command in it, no power, just warmth. When he left, Lucas waved shyly. Greta didn't. But after he was gone, she whispered to the darkness, "He'll come back." And for the first time since her mother's death, she hoped she was right. The first time Sergeant James Miller saw Hans and Lotte, they were huddled beneath a broken church window in Kassel. Snow had begun to fall again, soft and silent, covering the ruins like a shroud. He'd been part of the American unit sent to clear the area and deliver food aid to civilians. Most soldiers avoided eye contact with the children. There were too many like them, and each one reminded them of what the war had cost. But something about these two stopped him cold. Lotte's coat was 3 sizes too big. Hans's face was smeared with ash and pride. When Miller offered them chocolate rations, Hans refused. He glared with all the fury a 15-year-old could muster and spat at the snow. "We don't take from killers," he said. The words struck Miller harder than any bullet. He didn't argue. He just set the chocolate on the ground and walked away. That night Miller couldn't sleep. The barracks heater hissed and cracked, but his thoughts stayed frozen on those 2 faces. He'd seen what war did to kids. He had a son of his own back in Kansas, a boy just about Hans's age. And he couldn't shake the thought, what if it had been my boy? Over the next few days, he kept crossing paths with the siblings. They scavenged for scraps near the supply trucks, always together. Hans carried a dull knife tucked in his belt. Lotte clutched a tattered doll, missing one eye. They avoided soldiers like ghosts. One morning, Miller found them cornered by black market traders, men who bartered food for favors. Lotte's trembling hand was in one man's grip before Miller intervened. "Back off," Miller barked, his hand on his rifle. The traders retreated with muttered curses. Hans stood between Miller and his sister, chest heaving. "We didn't ask for help." "I know," Miller said quietly, "but you needed it." For the first time, Hans didn't look away. That night, Miller brought them to the American relief camp. The children hesitated, then followed. Lotte's eyes widened at the sight of real food. Bread, soup, even sugar cubes. But Hans refused to eat. "Why are you doing this?" he asked bitterly. "You killed my father." Miller looked down, voice low. "Maybe I did. Maybe not. But I can't change what's done. I can only make sure you live to see what comes after." Something in his tone, tired, honest human, broke through Hans's wall. He lowered his gaze, and for the first time in months, Lotte smiled. That night, the siblings slept indoors for the first time since the war began. The sound of wind outside was replaced by the steady, unfamiliar rhythm of peace. But peace was fragile. Hans woke at dawn, staring at the ceiling beams. He whispered to himself, "We don't belong here." Lotte stirred beside him and murmured, "Maybe we do." For the first time, Hans didn't argue. Spring arrived with muddy roads and blooming lilacs. The ruins of Kassel slowly filled with life again. Markets reopening, children laughing in the streets, and Allied trucks turning from conquerors to rebuilders. Hans and Lotte began working at the camp kitchens, learning English from Miller's patient corrections. The bond grew slowly, awkwardly, like a wound learning to heal. But when Miller's deployment ended, the unspoken dread set in. The day he told them he was going home, Lotte cried. Hans didn't. He simply turned away and muttered, "You'll forget us the moment you leave." Miller knelt beside him. "Son, I already tried to forget too much in this war. I'm done with that." He handed Hans an envelope, inside 2 letters of sponsorship and a photograph of a farmhouse in Kansas. "If you'll come, I'll make sure you both have a home." Hans stared at him, jaw trembling. "You mean, in America?" Miller nodded. "There's more than enough land and more than enough love for 2 more. It wasn't easy. The paperwork took months and the authorities questioned everything." "You're adopting Germans?" one officer scoffed. "War orphans?" "Yes," Miller replied simply. "War took enough children from me. I'm taking some back." When the ship finally set sail from Bremerhaven, the ocean stretched like an endless promise. Lotta clung to the rail, her hair whipping in the wind. "Do you think they'll like us?" she asked. Miller smiled. "They'll love you." Hans stood silent beside him, eyes fixed on the horizon. "America," he murmured. "I used to dream of bombing it." Miller looked at him softly. "Dream different this time." The journey was long and rough, but when they stepped off the ship in New York Harbor, something inside Hans shifted. The sight of the Statue of Liberty, the same symbol he'd been taught to hate, now shimmered like hope. Months later, in the golden fields of Kansas, Hans and Lotta finally laughed without guilt. Lotta joined school. Hans helped Miller rebuild the barn. One evening, Hans watched a storm roll over the plains and whispered, "This doesn't feel like punishment anymore." Miller rested a hand on his shoulder. "That's because it's not. It's a second chance." And for the first time in years, Hans believed him. At first, America felt like another planet. Everything was too bright, too loud, too clean. The street smelled of gasoline and bread instead of ash and gunpowder. The air was full of laughter that didn't sound cautious. For Hans, that was the strangest part. People laughing without fear. James Miller's farmhouse sat on a wide stretch of golden land just outside Wichita, Kansas. Rows of corn swayed in the wind, and a red barn stood proud against the sky. It should have felt like safety, but to Hans it felt like exile. He missed Germany, not the ruins, but the familiarity of pain. At least there he knew who he was, a boy who had lost everything. Here, he wasn't sure anymore. He worked hard, though. Every morning before sunrise, he joined Miller in the fields. They fixed fences, carried feed, mended broken tools. Miller never forced him to talk. He just worked beside him in silence, the kind that said, "You don't have to be okay yet." Lotta, on the other hand, bloomed. She learned English faster than anyone expected. Within weeks, she was helping Mrs. Miller bake pies and even giggling with neighbor kids. She'd started humming again, songs their mother used to sing in German. But for Hans, the world still felt wrong. When people smiled at him in town, he tensed. When they asked where he was from, he lied. "Denmark," he'd say quickly, avoiding the shame that came with the word German. One afternoon in the schoolyard, that lie shattered. A boy had asked where his accent came from. Hans hesitated, just long enough for the boy to sneer. "You're one of them, aren't you?" "A Nazi." The word sliced through him like shrapnel. Before he knew it, Hans's fist had connected with the boy's jaw. They both tumbled into the dirt, swinging wildly until a teacher dragged them apart. That night, Miller found Hans sitting on the porch steps, knuckles raw and bloody. The boy stared at the ground, trembling with a fury he couldn't name. "They'll never forgive us," he said quietly. "No matter what I do, I'll always be that German boy." Miller sat beside him, silent for a long moment. Then he said, "You know what my mother told me after Pearl Harbor? Hate makes you forget how to live." He looked at Hans. "You don't owe them forgiveness, son. You owe yourself peace." Hans didn't answer, but the words stuck. Weeks passed. The farm became routine. The smell of soil, the hum of cicadas, the creak of the windmill at dusk. Slowly, Hans started to see small things differently. How Mrs. Miller always set an extra plate for him without being asked. How the neighbors dropped by with baskets of fruit and said, "Welcome home," not "Welcome to America." Home. One Sunday, Miller took Hans and Lotta to church. The pews were filled with men who'd once fought Germans, just like Hans's father. When the pastor spoke about forgiveness, Hans wanted to shrink into the wood. But after the service, an elderly man approached him. His hand trembled slightly as he said, "You remind me of the boy I lost in France." And then he smiled. "I'm glad you made it here." Something broke open inside Hans, not in pain but in release. For the first time, he realized maybe this place wasn't about forgetting. Maybe it was about learning how to begin again. That night, he found Miller repairing the barn door.
"Can I help?"
Hans asked. Miller looked up, surprised, and then nodded. Together, under the Kansas stars, they hammered the hinges back in place. When they finished, Hans stood back, wiping sweat from his brow. "It's good as new," he said. Miller smiled. "No," he said softly. "It's stronger than before." Hans met his eyes. The words hit deeper than they sounded. He understood what Miller meant. And for the first time since the war, Hans didn't feel like an orphan anymore. The Kansas winter came softly that year. Frost painted the barn roof silver, and the field slept under a quiet layer of snow. For most people, it was just another season. But for Hans and Lotta, it felt like the first winter that didn't carry the sound of bombs. Every morning they woke to the smell of pancakes and coffee. Mrs. Miller hummed while cooking, and James read the newspaper in silence. The headlines still talked about Europe, trials, rebuilding, and the scars left behind. But for the two, German children who once slept in ruins, the world finally felt distant from pain. Yet even in peace, memories had a way of whispering. One night, Hans couldn't sleep. He stood by the window watching the snow fall across the fields, the sky glowing faintly orange from the distant town lights. For the first time, he realized he wasn't afraid of the dark anymore. It no longer hid danger. It just meant rest. Behind him, Lotta stirred. "Hans?" she murmured. "Do you think Mama and Papa would be happy here?" He hesitated, the question sinking deep. "I think—" He looked out again. "I think they'd be happy we're safe." Lotta smiled sleepily. "Mr. Miller says we'll go to the city next week to make it official." Hans nodded. Adoption papers, a new name, a new beginning. But beneath that, something else stirred, a fear he didn't want to admit. He wondered if by becoming someone else's son, he was betraying who he once was. A few days later, they drove into Wichita. Snow melted along the road, turning the world silver and gold. The courthouse loomed tall, an old brick building with an American flag waving in the cold wind. Inside, everything smelled of paper and ink. The judge smiled kindly. "So Hans and Lotta Hoffmann," he said. "You'll now be known as Hans and Lotta Miller." Mrs. Miller squeezed their hands. James's eyes shone, though he tried to hide it with a cough. Hans glanced at Lotta. Her smile was bright, innocent, free. He looked back at the judge and whispered, "Can I keep my old last name too, just at the end?" The room went quiet. The judge tilted his head. "Why's that, son?" Hans swallowed hard. "Because I don't want to forget them, the ones who didn't make it." For a moment, no one spoke. Then James placed a firm hand on Hans's shoulder. "You don't have to forget, son," he said softly. "You just have to live enough for all of them." The judge nodded slowly. "Then so be it." He wrote something on the paper, smiled, and said, "Welcome home, Hans Hoffmann Miller." It was such a simple phrase, and welcome home. But it hit like thunder. For years, Hans had searched for that feeling. Safety, warmth, belonging. And now, he felt it not in a place, but in the people around him. That evening, they returned to the farm. Lotta ran through the snow, laughing as she caught flakes on her tongue. Mrs. Miller watched her with tears in her eyes. Hans lingered behind with James, staring at the horizon where the sun bled red and gold. "It's beautiful," Hans said quietly. "Yeah," James replied. "You just have to keep looking forward to see it." Hans thought about the ruins they'd left behind, the graves they couldn't visit, the promises broken by war, and realized something profound. Survival wasn't just about staying alive. It was about choosing to hope again. That night, before bed, he took out the torn photograph, the only one that had survived Germany. He placed it on the windowsill, beside a small American flag Mrs. Miller had given him. Two worlds side by side. Not enemies, not opposites, just chapters of the same story. He whispered softly, "We made it." And as the wind carried his words through the quiet Kansas night, Hans Hoffmann Miller finally felt what his mother had promised long ago. That one day, the angels would come. He just never knew they'd wear American uniforms. Years later, Hans Hoffmann Miller stood before his classroom in Kansas, chalk in hand, telling his students about a war most of them could barely imagine. He never spoke of hatred. He spoke of mercy, of how a soldier's decision to save a child could echo through generations. History, he said softly, isn't just written by those who win wars. It's rewritten by those who refuse to keep fighting them. Lotta grew up to become a nurse, caring for children who'd lost their families, just as she once had. Together, they carried forward the kindness that had saved them, turning one soldier's compassion into a lifelong promise. And on every Christmas Eve, they visited the old Miller farm where a faded photograph still hung above the fireplace. A soldier, a woman, and 2 children smiling in the snow. Below it were 6 simple words carved into the wood. Mercy makes families out of enemies. That was their legacy, and their message to the world. Because in the end, history doesn't just remember who fought, it remembers who forgave. And maybe, if we remembered that more often, wars would end a little sooner.